PhD student at Durham University. And today I want to talk to you about an offshoot of my ongoing research, which explores UK museums' online content and how it changes over the past 5 years. Now, I've got quite a lot to convey in what feels like not nearly enough time. And part of the reason there's so much to discuss is that this is really the culmination of 3 complementary studies. The first I began as a small pilot study to look at the online presence of 315 accredited museums, which some of you may have seen at last year's DH, and that looked at museum accounts across 5 different social media platforms to give us a broad overview of the sector. And this led to teaming up with the wonderful Mapping Museum project group, including Fiona Candlin and my co-authors, Jamie Larkin and Andrea Ballatore. Now, they've been building a near comprehensive list of UK museums. So together, using web scraping and social media APIs, we then gather data on 3,300 or so UK museums' social media over the course of 3 years. With this larger data set, we were able to perform a more detailed analysis, including topic modeling, before expanding it out to look at museums' websites. And then finally, in order to try and better understand the trends we were seeing, I followed this up with supplementary interviews with over 20 museums. In fact, you'll be hearing a lot from the interviewees today because they're better informed and funnier than I can hear to be. I will figure out a good way of doing this. Great. So why are we doing all of this? Well, I wanted to know what museums were doing online, and in and amongst everything they're doing online, what's working well. So today's talk is going to be split into 2 sections. In the first, I'm going to explore the overarching trends, and then in the second half of the talk, I'll dig into 2 examples of types of museums which are outperforming their peers and ask what they're doing differently. Now, success on social media is incredibly subjective. Some museums aim for broad reach, others for depth of engagement, others still to increase their on-site visitor numbers. But for a long time, we simply didn't have the data to assess whether this was happening at scale. A lot of existing scholarship has been reliant on case studies, which is a wonderful way to highlight new projects, but unsurprisingly, the most innovative work is generally done at well-resourced museums, those who have in-house expertise and, most importantly, time to experiment, including hosting nosy researchers like me. But as you can imagine, this means the overstretched, under-resourced museums are underrepresented in scholarship, and that's the majority of the sector. This includes unaccredited museums, those run by volunteers, or those with staff who stretch across multiple roles. Oh no, I didn't like that. One very memorable interview summed up the position of hundreds of museum practitioners. For all my sins, I'm the only one of us that understands the ITs, I guess because I'm younger. So when we take this kind of museum into account, how does our perception of the sector shift? Well, we started by asking how many organizations are actually on social media. Now, some of you may recognize this or have seen it before, but it's useful context. It shows the proportion of museums who have an account on each platform. And okay, it's late, everyone's tired, but before I go into detail, can I see a show of hands? And don't worry, I won't pick on you. Who has an active Facebook account? Okay, not bad, not bad. And who has an active Twitter account? Or X rather? And lastly, TikTok. Amazing. We will come back to this. But as you can see, the majority of museums have chosen Facebook as their main social media platform, and 85% of accredited museums have an account. But as you can see, not every platform has been adopted. Okay. Not every platform has been adopted equally. TikTok is only used by 7% of museums, and those that have an account, the majority of which have not posted a single video. Meanwhile, Snapchat use is so low that we haven't included it in our figure. We're talking less than a single percent. Now, considering that a survey conducted by Nesta found that over 20% of museums post to social media to reach a younger audience, this is interesting. Because 2/3 of UK Facebook users are over the age of 35. Please don't be embarrassed if you raise your hand earlier. In contrast, over half of TikTok and Snapchat's UK users are under the age of 35. They're young platforms. So it seems significant that younger audiences are mainly on platforms that museums just don't use. And this is probably a contributing factor to the audience agency's finding that over half of museums' online audiences are over the age of 55. They also found that most of them were likely to be regular in-person visitors, suggesting that social media use hadn't significantly diversified or broadened museums' audiences. In our data, we also saw more pessimistic findings that flew in the face of widely reported anecdotal evidence. While museums were posting far more than they ever had before, levels of engagement were pretty static, and museum audiences didn't see any significant growth. In the 5-platform study, only the 2 largest museums, that's the British Museum and the Royal Academy, saw any significant increase in the number of followers they had and the number of people who were interacting with their posts. And we found similar trends across the 3 years of Facebook and Twitter data. Looking at engagement with museums' Facebook posts, there's an increase in the small number of posts that go viral, generating a lot of engagement, and this bumps up the overall mean levels of interaction. So the overall and mean are the top 2 lines that you see here. And this kind of success is driven by the recommendation algorithms on each of the social media platforms. These dictate what users see when they log in, usually under some kind of personalized For You page. Sometimes these systems will recommend a post far beyond the account's usual reach. However, it's a black box algorithm, and we don't really know how it works. We can, however, see general trends in what it favors, including recently uploaded content, accounts that post regularly, high-resolution images, video content, and short posts. Most controversially, it's also been found to favor content that is divisive and upsetting, which drives user engagement as people then argue in the comments and share it further. This will come up again later, but I'm not going to dive into it in much depth today. We've explored this trend in our data, and if you're interested, there's a QR code at the end of the presentation. Oh, sorry, that was I'm not very good at doing 2 laptops at once, what can I say? But looking away from the very top performance to the median, we see that it's relatively stable. At its peak, it rises by a single interaction or 2 per post. And when we put this in the context of a 10-year window, we see it falls well within the general fluctuations of what we'd expect to see. And I should point out that Facebook is the platform that museums are by far and away the best at. More than 50% of museum tweets don't have a single interaction, and museum YouTube channels have 45 subscribers or less. 50% of the museum YouTube channels have 45 subscribers or less. In a parallel to what we saw with the existing scholarship, is this great rift between the most digitally savvy museums and everyone else. On Facebook, this is most extreme, where just 1% of the museums receives all of the interactions, receive 60% of the interactions with all museum accounts. So who are these high performers? Well, if you look across social media accounts and different platforms, it's generally large museums that have larger audiences. Museum size is by far the best predictor of their following, and this is unsurprising. With dedicated social media staff, they're far more likely to be able to create videos with expensive camera equipment and publish things regularly. If you remember, these are things that are more likely to get your content recommended by the algorithm. And they're all relatively resource intensive, representing a big commitment to small museums. So the 2 examples I pulled out today, I've done so because I think they offer a different model of what social media success can look like. The first became apparent when we started exploring the data set by the subject. So this graph shows museums grouped by the type of thing in their collection. For example, arts, industry, nature, and their average number of followers on the platform. And we can start to see that the different platforms have very different audiences. On Twitter, archaeology is the best performing category, while on Instagram, a visual platform, it's art. But notably, both Facebook and YouTube are dominated by transport museums, and to a rather impressive extent. It seems strange. The posts of transport museums are often very detailed and very long, which flies in the face of general social media advice. But it turns out that when we began our interviews with museum professionals, everybody has a story about transport. One interviewee at a small local history museum recounted posting about the acquisition of a vintage car. I just happened to put a post on Facebook. The next thing I know, there's a national newspaper that said they want to come and take pictures. It's falling apart, but they don't care. Everyone's been on the phone. And then when we investigated this using the bigger data set, the enthusiasm for transport was even more obvious. On Facebook, the median number of interactions on a regular post is 15. But for transport museums, that's 3.5 times the number at 53. This is also true of any post that touches on transport. We performed topic modeling, and transport dominated the top 10 topics. We used both LDA and BERT topic, and BERT topic produced by far the most comprehensible results. But I have my hesitations about evaluating that kind of topic model. So if any of you are working on something similar, I would love to hear from you. But I realized that for today, there was a way simpler and easier way of showing this to you. Green here indicates posts that contain words, post-summatization, that are associated with transport. Train, gauge, carriage, and for comparison, we've also included posts that include words containing words to do with war and conflict, that's in red, cute animals in blue, museum's core objective in orange, and finally, sales and commerce in pink. And we visualized how they compare with the average levels of engagement on the platform, which is the blue line. Now, here you can see the slightly uncomfortable finding that I alluded to earlier, raising its head. Posts about World War II, especially, and war and conflict here in red, have quite high levels of engagement, and they also rank quite highly in topic modeling. World War II seems to be a particular cultural touchstone. It's been interesting to hear some of the talks over the last few days. Ben Miller's presentation yesterday on online extremism pointed out how much the far right talk about the past, contrasting that to how jihadist groups focus more on the future. Obviously, I'm butchering the nuance of this presentation, but it's interesting. And then again, this morning, Claire Warwick, who discussed user prompts with generative AI, noticed the strong association with right-wing politicians like Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen, with older imagery like knights riding into battle. And when we did a network analysis of mentions on Twitter, we found that the vast majorities of communities were geographically close. And the only exception to this were museums focused on war and conflict, which had their own community, which included many rather right-wing politicians in the UK. Now, this is all kind of the topic for another talk, and I promised you a good news story today. So in a more light-hearted vein, I can confirm a bias towards kittens on Twitter. Now, that's the unusually high bar on the right, twice as high as puppies next to it. But rather more clearly, it's posts about transport on both Facebook and Twitter that do really well compared to museums' posts about, there's kittens. There we go. But posts they do really well compared to posts about learning, events, tickets, exhibitions, or shops, which is the bread and butter of most museums' social media. Posts to do with trains do particularly well and have very high levels of interaction, which I can tell you came as a complete shock to every transport museum I spoke to. They thought that everybody had this level of engagement. So is transport just inherently interesting? The people who it attracts extend far beyond what we might traditionally think of as a stereotypical enthusiast. This is Francis Bourgeois, one of the breakout TikTok stars in the UK. He has over 3 million followers and now his own series on Channel 4. His videos are about train spotting almost exclusively and entirely consist of him getting very excited about railways. And in part due to his choice of platform, TikTok, his following is mainly under the age of 25. One of our interviewees had a theory about the universality of transport. Even if you're not a big car or train person, people like transport because it's so nostalgic. As a subject, I think you remember what car your parents drove when you were little, because you have so many visceral memories of sitting in the back seat. And a small majority are really keen. While they didn't record figures, multiple transport museums across the UK referred to regular international visitors. One small rural museum receiving visitors from the US, Norway, Japan, and Germany all within a week. And this is important, as for most museums, there's a resignation that what you do on social media isn't going to convert into people visiting. To quote a highly successful social media manager, 39% of our social media audience live in the US. which means it's highly likely that 39% of all people who follow us are never actually going to visit the museum. But we've repeatedly found that people are willing to travel to remote rural locations, and tourists, especially from the US, are willing to travel to what many in the UK consider unfathomable distances. And this is where our second example comes in. Looking back at the data, when we carve this up a bit differently and look at groups rather than subjects, group it up by subjects but not location, we see something else that's quite interesting. On Facebook, levels of engagement with Scottish and Northern Irish rural museums are second only to London, which hosts some of the biggest museums in the country. And on Twitter, Scottish rural museums are the top performers. Interviewing a small Scottish museum run entirely by volunteers, it came out that they had received £250,000 from an Australian donor who shared his name with their local town. With no children or descendants, he had decided to donate his estate to help preserve their local archive, having never been in person. The next interview shed some light on the matter. Word is obviously getting out. It's probably true of many small museums in Scotland because of their diaspora. The family and club names that come from this area generate interest when people are doing research in the States. And the more Scottish and Northern Irish museums we interviewed, the more the impact of the Highland clearances in Scotland, forced deportation to Australia, and Irish economic migration became apparent in the audiences. Now, there are too many to read here, but this is only a fraction of the quotes, and it was on a scale that I hadn't quite anticipated. Another small Scottish museum, who kept accurate visitor logs, reported that 16% of their visitors were from the US. This place, for context, was over an hour's drive to the nearest town, no matter the nearest city. And the more museums we spoke to, the more we found they were experimenting with new ways to engage with these international audiences. Some began charging for online video talks, just a few pounds, but they also gave visitors the option to round up and increased by adding a donation, which generated a significant income. And the appetite for this seems pretty significant, as the Northern Irish Museum reported that 30% of their regular attendees for their talk series were from the USA. Others we spoke to provided on-request digitization of archival documents. But it seems that developing infrastructure like this is still in its infancy, in part because these audiences are reported to have peaked during the pandemic, with staff and volunteers returning to front of house duties when museums reopened in 2021. They simply haven't had the time to produce this kind of content since the pandemic. But many of them are hopeful that they can recapture some of that momentum in the future, and they're continually asked by their visitors for these resources. Now, granted, these resources don't bear much resemblance to those of transport museums, but is there something we can take away from how both of these groups have grown their online platforms? Well, both digital strategies fly in the face of conventional social media wisdom. They don't necessarily post regularly, they don't conform to the latest social media trends or talk about news or celebrities, and their content is obscenely long, both in text and with videos running to multiple hours in length. In fact, they don't really do anything that would increase their chances of being shown to users by the recommendation algorithms. But they've created incredible, in-depth resources for people who are already looking for them. And they've channeled their limited resources into being findable, not discoverable. You're not likely to stumble across their content by chance, but if you go looking for it, it's there. And for people who do have a personal connection with these places and objects, it can be incredibly moving if they choose to visit, quite literally. And it's true that they're not necessarily diversifying their audience, but if you remember, social media is a pretty ineffective tool for that anyway. And to reach beyond your existing base, to chase the recommendation algorithm, requires resources and expertise that most museums simply don't have. Unless I get a bit sentimental, I think that's something that audiences deeply appreciate in the authenticity of both shamelessly not conforming to trends, but also of dedicating time to remembering and archiving something that might be considered niche, or that only has a direct relevance to a handful of people. To quote the American author Jacqueline Woodson, if you generalize, it doesn't resonate. The specificity of it is what resonates. So, that's been an offshoot of what I've been working on recently. If you'd like to meet him or have questions or would just like to grab a coffee, please get in touch. I'd be delighted to hear from you.
Excellent, thank you. Wrapped up just on time as well, so we're really on a roll here. So, questions from the audience?